All right, Coalition Purple back on the line. And hey, John, how you doing?
Very good. Very
Good to
pleased
hear.
to
And
have.
we want to go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, very pleased to have Richard Bailey with us today, former mayor of Coronado. I believe an economics professor, maybe at San Diego, University of San Diego. So quite a lettered fellow to talk to today. So we're very, very happy and honored to have him.
Glad to be with you guys. Thanks for the invitation.
That's great. Well, we really were attracted by what you've been doing with your videos and all of that. It just kind of sings the song that we try and sing in terms of just, hey, let's have some discussions. Let's not get into these political debates and all that, but just kind of focus on solutions and all of that versus taking the talking points and kind of rehashing, those things. So I was my first question was really kind of focused on what kind of motivated you to start that.
Yeah, I when I first got into the elected official role back in 2012, I was first on the Coronado City Council. I actually had this naive thought that, this is where all the big partisan battles happen at the local government, and this is red versus blue, and where you could really, make a difference for your political party. And that was very naive of me, and it became, wait a second, no, like most of the issues, in fact, probably 99% of the issues we deal with, especially at the local level, have nothing to do with partisanship whatsoever, but are squarely just based on policy and trying to determine what the best policy is for the folks you represent. And so that's kind of what began my process over the past 12 years. First 4 years as a council member, then 8 years as mayor. And since I've been out of office for just under a year now, I have a business located over in the city of San Diego. So I've always paid attention to the issues in San Diego, but I've never felt it was appropriate for me to comment on them because as the mayor of Coronado, I didn't think it was necessarily I'm a big believer in stay in your own lane. So I just didn't feel comfortable commenting on how other cities were running. But it was around the time the city was going through its draft budgets. And I have a beach and bike rental shop over in Mission Beach, and they were talking about removing the beach fire rings. And I just thought, gosh, you have a $250 million structural deficit, and you're talking about removing beach fire rings to help close this deficit. And I'm like, that can't be right. Like, that just can't be right. This is just another example, like nickeling and diming. So I made a video about that, just try to break down kind of the city's budget. Here's what they're saying they're trying to do by removing the fire rings. And I was just blown away by the feedback from that one video. And it just kind of occurred to me, I think there's a growing appetite for a true policy-oriented conversation. And so that's what kind of kickstarted it. As you start peeling back the layer of, all right, well, they're trying to remove beach fire rings to close the budget. Well, why is the budget deficit so large? And you start pulling back these layers, and you're like, all right, there's a lot of content there that people might be interested in understanding.
Yeah, and ultimately it does kind of come down to the economics of so many of these things and trying to figure out what's the correct priority. John and I have this conversation a lot about, there's definitely a need for some programs out there to help whatever constituency that might be a little specialized or whatever. But at the end of the day, you do have to prioritize things, and kind of get back to the common sense things. And people get sort of balled up in well, that's me and their turfs and all that. And it's like, how do we come together? What has been your experience in terms of trying to facilitate those kind of discussions out there among folks?
I have found that there are some people, Democrats and Republicans, where their personal identity is wrapped up in their party affiliation. And I'll be perfectly honest and say at one point in my life, I was guilty of that myself. And the analogy I like to use is the Barry Bonds syndrome, where back when Barry Bonds was playing baseball, after he had been busted for performance enhancing drugs, whenever he would go to a visiting ballpark, he would be booed mercilessly. Like the fans would just come out of their seats booing this man who, cheated the game. But when Barry Bonds played in front of his home crowd, standing ovations, right? He was cheered. Why? Because he was one of them. And I'm like, there's just got to be a better way. Like in sports, it's fine. Root for the jerseys, right? Seinfeld used to say, "Hey, you're actually just rooting for the jerseys," and that's fine in sports. But when it comes to public policy, bad public policy isn't exclusive to either political party, and good public policy is not, unfortunately, that common in either political. And it's because we're trying to beat the other side. And that just unfortunately leaves constituents oftentimes losing. So I try to frame things from a policy standpoint and not a party standpoint whenever possible.
Well, one of the things that we talk a lot about on this show, obviously, and it is kind of in a way the maybe even the main thing that we talk about is the introduction of a new party or a third party or just an independent set of votes to sort of move things along. And obviously, many times over the years, people have tried to do things like that, and it isn't necessarily always successful. But from your perspective, I'd be really interested to know because, like, I think you feel the same way about these things in a lot of respects that we are. That there's this big divide between the two parties that are constantly at each other's throats, and they're almost, predetermined their positions by whatever their affiliation is. And you're a person with actual experience. You've been the mayor. You've dealt with these things. How do we overcome this divide to actually move things forward in a better way? Is there a way to overcome it, or do we need to really think about making something new?
Uh-oh. You still there, Richard?
Shoot, John, I think I lost the last 10 seconds of your question. Is there a way to overcome it, or John?
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah, I'm
Or
barely.
you were frozen there for a minute.
Oh, my apologies. John, would you mind repeating the last few seconds of your question? You were asking, is there a way to overcome it, or
Well, the thing is, I feel like the divide between the two parties is so institutionalized these days that, even if you can get a message out that's positive, the parties are sort of locked in their positions and unable to cooperate. And so you get very partisan outcomes, regardless of whether it's partisan Democrat or partisan Republican. And I was just wondering what your perspective on was what can we change to sort of break that up and sort of try and actually get good common sense policy through, in the various levels of government.
yeah, I'm reminded of a saying that the electorate gets the representatives they deserve. And if the electorate cares more about, say, who Kim Kardashian is dating than they do about the tax policy at the state level and our infrastructure programs at the local level, then shame on all of us. But it's also a two-way street where we need the electorate to care enough to actually want to know what the elected officials' policies are when they're running for office. And we also need elected officials that have the intellectual integrity to be able to say, hey, this is what good policy looks like, and this is what bad policy looks like, regardless of what party I'm a part of. And, unfortunately, I think both parties, as you were saying, John, both parties, you almost kind of knew, it was predetermined what side of the issue they were going to be on. And it almost seems
Yeah.
like now, when one party champions one position, the other party instinctively says, well, then I'm against it. Even
Yeah.
if they used to be for it just a few years ago. And that to me really just kind of reinforces the point. Wait a second. The two parties seem to care more about maintaining their share of power than actually implementing good policies for the rest of us. And that's a total shame.
Yeah,
Have
I
you, have
absolutely,
you,
I couldn't agree more. And again, as I say, just because this is somewhat the theme of our show, is we do talk about the idea of having a third party that could, represent people in a more responsible way and make it more difficult for the parties to just pit themselves against each other. If there's a third option, it can't just be party A is right, party B is wrong, because then you're not addressing party C. And so that's
Right.
been our perspective on this show for a long time. But obviously, that's extremely difficult, to happen. I mean, there's reasons we don't have a lot of new parties. And as I say, I just personally want to say that it's so great to hear someone who's actually been involved in the in politics and holding an office, talking in such a sensible way, because it would be great to have someone that people recognize talking responsibly and championing the ideas that actually help people to sort of maybe help the disaffected voters of California who are, I think, very unhappy with the political situation to maybe coalesce around someone or something to actually have a chance to get a message out and make more progress.
I think you're absolutely right. And I think that the appetite for that is growing. And a couple things come to mind that you and your listeners might be interested in knowing. Um, there is an inherent political disadvantage from a fundraising standpoint by running unaffiliated. And what I mean by that is you have in the state of California, which sets our local and state campaign financing rules, if you run as a Republican, you run as a Democrat, you are allowed to, one, raise money into your own campaign, and also direct funds into your respective political party, oftentimes to an unlimited amount, and then you are legally allowed to coordinate with your party on how those funds get spent. If you are a non-party affiliated candidate, you have no other fundraising vehicle to coordinate with other than your own campaign committee. So you are severely limited from a fundraising standpoint because of how the campaign finance laws are structured, which is a big reason why it's more common than not for people to choose a party to be a part of and run with them, even if they might not necessarily agree with all of their politics, especially at the local level. And unfortunately, the only way around is you have to have a candidate that's either independently wealthy and can self-fund and not have to rely on party affiliation, or a candidate that is well known enough in the community and respected enough and also understands how how campaigns work to kind of circumvent these campaign finance laws that leave independents at a strategic disadvantage. And so if you have the combination of those two things, someone that can either independently fundraise or fundraise themselves, and or is well known in the community, that's the only way to kind of overcome the two-party advantage right now.
Yeah.
Right.
Well,
And
it's
so much of
interesting
it,
that you
and we
would.
talk about this quite.
Oh,
Go
I
ahead,
was just
Jeff.
going to mention that you had said that one of the criterion for somebody running a successful campaign was somebody that's well known in a community and has the respect of that community. And I think I saw somewhere that when you ran for mayor in your last term, you got 99% of the vote.
I did. Yeah.
So if you're thinking about running again, maybe you just described exactly yourself. So it might be interesting.
It's I definitely benefited from some unique election circumstances that cycle. But I'm glad actually. I'm glad there's someone else on the ballot so I could claim that 99%.
Right. Well, and back to the whole campaign finance, I think that's the other topic that we address a lot. It does come down to money. At the end of the day, it comes down to money, and that's where even at the local level, I'm really starting to sense it's gotten so difficult that you have to kind of pay the piper depending on who's funding your campaign. And I mean, we've talked a lot about how do we fix that? Because again, we're trying to just start a discussion about how do we solve these problems, not just keep repeating the problems or talk about the problems. And we always end up, well, you definitely need some kind of campaign finance reform, or and I'll steal John's thunder because it was the first time I heard it when John mentioned it was, well, maybe we just limit how much they can spend on a campaign. Not don't worry about the supply side of it, but what they do with that money, cap that. So because you're always going to have these shenanigans going on, basically, right? When it comes to campaign, that doesn't happen as much at the local level, but in a place like San Diego, a large city, or LA, or places like that, you are getting up to the level of a federal election and things like that sometimes with some of the money that's going on right now.
Oh, absolutely. There's no doubt that this last mayoral election in the city of San Diego spent more money than most of the congressional districts uh, throughout the country. One thing that comes to mind is when you go back and you look at the campaign finance reports from the 9 council members that are representing the city of San Diego right now, the vast majority of all of their fundraising came from outside of the district. So it's pretty typical that your in-district fundraising is typically going to be smaller dollar donations. And that is a sign of a good campaign, right? When you can amass a lot of small dollar donations, which are hard, like they take a lot of time, there's a lot of copies, there's a lot of meet and greets, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But when you can do that, not only because then you're in touch with your district, And also, when it then comes time to vote on policies that might be controversial, you're less likely to be persuaded by the quote unquote special interests and more likely to do what's right by your constituents because it was your constituents that got you elected. But when the vast majority of funds are coming from outside of your district, and there's special interests on both sides of the aisle, but probably the most dominating special interests right now within the city of San Diego politics are the local labor unions. Most of your financial backing is coming from the labor unions. It's human nature that if you want to run for office and this other group helped get you elected, you're probably going to be more persuaded or more naturally inclined to find a reason or find an excuse to vote for a policy that might not be in your constituents' best interest, but helps curry favor with the folks that got you elected. And if they're outside your district, they're outside your district. And so I think, once again, getting back to candidates that are really successful tend to be those that have great grassroots communities and can actually fundraise from those communities so that they are essentially independent of special interests.
Would you consider maybe making it illegal to donate to campaigns from outside a district? I mean, restrict fundraising to a district, and then smaller races would obviously have smaller amounts of funds, and larger races that are like statewide would have statewide donators. Would you think that legislation to restrict funding like that would be a good idea? And is it possible to get it passed?
Great question. So conceptually it makes sense. Like the sentiment, I think, is shared by many people that are kind of disillusioned by the amount of money in politics and also where that money is coming from. But from a constitutional perspective, it's very, very difficult to limit that type of speech. And then the other component is there's typically always going to be a workaround. Like, let's say hypothetically it was not a violation of the First Amendment. Raise the same amount of funds from inside your district. Well, then if you're a local labor union, or let's say you're a large developer, well, then maybe you open up an office, PO box inside the district to try to circumvent those laws to be able to raise funds for that particular candidate. So I think it has probably some constitutional challenges, but then also some workarounds that would kind of undercut the intent of that.
I have to say that I
Yeah, and I
am in
guess that's
complete agreement with you on that, because that's why, because Bill mentioned this before, that I've always sort of been hawkish about the idea of like restricting the amount that can be spent, because respecting what can be donated is so complicated and so fraught with difficulty that I've always kind of felt like it isn't necessarily going to work very well. So I really agree with what you said there, and I can really appreciate the complexity.
yeah. And I, that it's just an interesting way of approaching it in terms of the how much you can spend, because everybody has the equal is equal then, right? As far as being able to, as long as you don't spend this much, do what you want to do, right? Basically. I don't know. Probably there's some constitutional issue with that too. That I'm certainly not a lawyer, so heck if I know. But it's one of those things to be pondering. Yeah.
I was
So
just
where
going to
do
sort
you
of
go
move
from
on.
here? Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, just because I was thinking about moving on to a slightly new question, which was, is there any particular item or issue that you have a particularly great concern with right now that you'd like a chance to talk about?
For me, most of my commentary has been around good governance in the city of San Diego or lack thereof. And for me, everything starts and stops with the budget. I know there's a lot of hyper local issues, especially around housing, that are causing neighborhood groups to be really concerned, and understandably so. But right now the city is facing a structural deficit, and that's a structural deficit even without setting aside additional funds for their general fund reserves. The city's in a really, really precarious financial position, and the increase in trash fees, the increase in parking fees, it is not going to come close to being enough. And it's just simple math. To think that we have a city as large as ours, a $2+ billion general fund, revenue and expenditures annually, eighth largest city in the country, it is not unfathomable that with a couple more bad decisions, or if we wait just a couple more years to really restructure City Hall, we will be staring down the barrel of bankruptcy. Like there's That's not a outlandish statement to make. Like that's what the city's own budget shows us, and those are with rosy projections. And so I wish, I know people are starting to pay attention more to the budget because now it's actually affecting their day-to-day lives with the increase in cost of living from these city policies. But man, it is the alarm bell should be ringing at City Hall.
Yeah, it's pretty crazy what's going on in San Diego right now, and I don't mean to point out San Diego. I mean, the larger you get, I think obviously the more complicated it gets. So when we look at some of the smaller towns, probably Coronado, doesn't have to stress quite as much about certain things because you can get your head around and hand around it, and it's just easier to deal with a smaller group of people. So the larger it is, no doubt it's more complex. But what San Diego's going through right now, I feel for them because, and we talk about this a lot too, trying to you end up trying to correct one thing, and it ends up having all these other consequences. And one of your recent videos was over the $25 an hour, minimum wage issue, and how that impacts certain aspect. Also, the parking zone now, that was another one. It impacts certain zones, except for, ironically, the city itself when it comes to how much you have to pay as a minimum wage or how much you have to pay for parking. Well, that's everybody except for the
Except
city
for
itself, which,
City of
Yeah,
San Diego.
classic corruption on that one.
And what's good for the goose is good for the gander, right? Like, if $25 minimum wage makes sense, if that is good policy, if that is what you truly believe is good policy, then you should have the courage to like lean fully into that and apply it to yourselves. And if you're not willing to apply it to yourself, well, maybe it's not such good policy.
And
right. I mean,
one of the things
that
that I
it's just
wanted
so
to
apparent. Go ahead.
no, I was just going to say that when we're talking about the size of government, I think that's actually kind of an important thing. Because one thing that you see sort of as a general trend within governments, whether the biggest governments or the smallest ones, is they keep expanding. You keep hiring more and more people, which means you have to pay more and more salaries. And then not only are you paying for the people that you're putting into the government, all those people feel a need to justify their existence. So they come up with more programs, more fees, more costs, more different things that they just need something to do, even if that thing that they're doing isn't necessarily productive or particularly worthwhile. And so as the government inflates in size, it just generates its own cost until you get to the point where the cost of just keeping the government alive is so vast that you don't have the money to do anything else.
It's true. And I used to think this was a uniquely governmental bureaucracy problem. However, having worked for a couple of very large corporations, I was kind of surprised to see that also was a
Yeah.
tendency within these large private companies. Now, the
Absolutely.
difference, of course, is that who holds those private companies accountable? Where the shareholders do. And ultimately, if they're not, meeting the bottom line, then eventually, in a relatively short order, there will be course corrections because shareholders and the board of directors will demand it. But what if the board of directors from those companies was put in there by the the same contractors that were getting work from the company? Well, then it's
Yeah.
unlikely that board of directors would change, and it's more likely those bad policies would continue, which is kind of what we're seeing over in on the government bureaucracy side. And and so like on the private sector, it does happen for sure, but there's an incentive structure to reduce it. On the public sector side, that incentive structure just doesn't exist in the same way.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. I've seen that having worked with some large companies too. And you addressed this actually in one of your videos too. And I encourage everybody to go subscribe to your videos because they're amazing. We'll
Absolutely.
put a link down in the show notes because they're phenomenal. You do such a great job with them. Um, but one of the things you mentioned in one of them recently was really a lot of it comes down to what are ultimately the metrics by which success is being achieved, which is something you do kind of see a lot more on the corporate side. They do it on the public side, but
Yeah.
a lot of, at least in my experience, it's a little more loose in terms of what those metrics might be. And so much of it is, the old thing. It's like you're going to succeed by you're going to be rewarded for success, right? And those that kind of metric kind of mentality, it doesn't necessarily exist as much, it seems like, on the public side.
Bill, you know what's been surprising to me as I've dove into the city of San Diego's budgets over the past 20 plus years now, is most departments have performance metrics specific to those departments, which I was encouraged to see, right? Because, how do you know what your performance should be if you have nothing to hold you accountable? And what you ended up seeing around 2015 was this massive increase in spending and massive increase in staffing across every department, nearly every department. Ironically, not public safety so much, but nearly every other department. And what you found is this corresponding decrease in performance. Nearly every single metric in nearly every single department has seen a reduction in performance, even as spending has increased, even as staffing has increased. And probably the most shocking example of this is streetlight repairs, which have gone from the city's goal is about 3 days, and they haven't hit on average 3 days, and as long as they've been tracking it. But it used to be around a week to 2, maybe 3 weeks on average, depending on the year. And now it is up to over 500 days. It's so bad, in fact, the city refuses to even accept new complaints for streetlights being out. And you're just like, wait a second here, where did all the money go? Where did what benefits have all the staff been provided? And if they haven't provided any benefits to the constituents, and we're running this, $250 million structural deficit, we should start there. We have to start there.
Yeah.
Right. Well,
Yeah.
it's the easiest way to manage it. It's just simply, hey, what are we trying to achieve here? I mean, and that has just really kind of seemed to escape us. It's more about showing some activity, but not necessarily the results of that activity.
Right.
And
It's become much more
it's a
performative.
challenge. I get it. Yeah.
I think a big part of it is going to be.
So we're getting
I was just going to say, in the end, the only way to really change things, though, is we must elect people who are dedicated to fixing the problems, fixing the bloat, dedicated to transparency and efficiency. And, if we can't get those people elected into office and we keep electing the same people, those same people will keep doing the same thing. Because like you were saying about, private corporations, business, there's this natural tendency for bloat. Things want to bloat. So unless you're electing people that are highly conscious of that and dedicated to reducing the bloat, you're just going to get more bloat.
It's true. And, one of the one of the tendencies we're seeing now in local politics, and this is local politics throughout the country. Oftentimes, when a candidate is running for office, they have a relatively small campaign staff, maybe 3 to 6 individuals. And when they get elected, they will take those 3 to 6 individuals, campaign staffers, and they will then become their public policy advisors when they're on the city council. And so you look at that and you're like, wait a second, well, what is your subject matter expertise in? Campaigning?
right.
That doesn't necessarily make you qualified to advise a council member on anything other than campaigning. And then what you see is when that council member moves on to another office or terms out, who are oftentimes now the main frontrunners to replace them? They're staffers who
Yeah.
show competency in anything other than campaigning and now policy advising, which they all learned on the job, and I think that is a big reason why there's this perception that elected officials now are becoming increasingly out of touch with average San Diegans, because they just are, right? Like the average San Diegan has a very diverse background of experiences. And when you look at the composition of our current city council, they have nearly identical experiences, and their staff even more so.
Yeah, no, that's really true. Well, we're getting close to probably running this up, but I want to kind of leave you with one last question. Are you feeling optimistic or pessimistic about just, and maybe not, I'm not even thinking so much just San Diego, because I know that's where you've got some focus right now, but just generally about kind of where things are in the whole political realm of dealing with these kind of issues and the political process.
Some days yes, some days no. I wish I could say unequivocally yes, I'm feeling optimistic, but that'd be a lie. I've been very, very encouraged with the feedback I've received from these videos and what I consider to be policy-oriented conversations from people from all over the country. Even though they're mostly local issues, like I've heard from people all over the country across the political spectrum, and that is really encouraging to me. But I'm just one voice in a sea of many, and unfortunately, those that tend to get the most clicks and get the most headlines are those that are the most hyperbolic. And unfortunately, it's not hyperbole that's going to actually make our roads, free of potholes or provide for a
Yeah.
quick public safety response time, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But I do think there's an appetite for those conversations with regular, everyday San Diegans, Californians, and Americans that if you had the right elected officials, we could really lean into that.
Well, thank you so much for having this conversation with us. This has been fantastic. I'm so glad you were able to
Yeah.
come on the show.
Hey, my pleasure. Let's do it again soon.